Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's Valerie Monroe and it's Bookwormy. And over there in the corner is Mimi the Calico Cat. Mimi is here today sitting on our couch listening to Down the Swale. Now, remember yesterday, John was showing Brogden some really cool things that were in his great-grandfather's special room in their house. And one of them was kaleidoscopes. So we looked at those yesterday. If you remember in that part of the chapter, he also talked about binoculars. I actually have two pairs of binoculars. They're both pretty powerful. Binoculars let you see something far away, close up. And so I use these to look outside at animals and get a closer look if I can't get closer to that animal. So if you want to have some fun today, grab your binoculars and go look outside, maybe look in the trees and see what's going on out there. So we're ready to read more of this chapter and see what goes on while Brogden is at John and Elaine's house. The kaleidoscopes weren't the only items that John's great-grandfather had made. John showed Brogden several watercolor paintings, pottery he'd shaped from the island's earth clay, and a small homemade wooden glider that was hanging from the ceiling. There were also glass paperweights with pressed flowers. Now, I just want to stop here and show you. I actually brought along a glass paperweight. It has my initial in it. And someone made this paperweight for me a long time ago, but you could put just about anything in a paperweight. Carved soapstone statues of waterfowl, reed flutes, and a collection of glass animals. Hundreds of maroon-covered books with gold embossed titles stood neatly in cases along an entire wall. "Bath's ready," Elaine interrupted. She led Brogden down the second of the closed doors, where a claw-footed tub was filled with about 6 inches of bubbly water. "I assumed you'd want bubbles," she smiled. "They're so relaxing." She showed him where she had laid out some washcloths, a bar of soap, and a small plastic sailboat that she'd found in the attic, and one of John's T-shirts for him to change into. She closed the door, and for the next half hour, Brogden enjoyed the only bubble bath he'd ever had in his life. He floated the boat up and down in the warm, sudsy water and scrubbed his skin and hair clean. He felt rejuvenated when he emerged and put on John's T-shirt. It was much too large for him. He had to gather it up in folds and hold it in his hands when he walked so he wouldn't trip, but it had a crisp, cozy feeling that made him feel quite snuggly. "I'm going to give these a wash," Elaine said, gathering up his dirty, smelly clothes when he came out of the bathroom. "Thank you," Brogden said before letting out an enormous yawn. He followed Elaine back down the hall to the guest room. The bed stood so high that he couldn't see the top of it, only the checkered quilt that hung down around the sides. He grabbed hold of a corner and, like a mountain climber, used it to scale the mattress. Once on top, he saw that it created the illusion of sitting on a soft, puffy cloud. He was certain he was going to have pleasant dreams. Elaine helped him pull the blankets back, and then he laid his head back on the pillow, which really did feel like a puffy cloud. After she'd pulled the covers up to his chin, John came back into the room, and the two of them sat on the bed smiling at him. "Would you like a story?" John asked. Brogden said he most definitely would. Aunt Hazel often told him stories before he went to sleep. "But I'm not going to tell you a story," John said. "I'm going to read you a story out of a book, okay?" "Okay," Brogden replied. Standing in front of the wall of books, John read some of the titles aloud. Black Beauty, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Moby Dick, Around the World in 80 Days, The Three Musketeers, The Wizard of Oz. These were classics, John explained. They all sounded so interesting that Brogden couldn't decide which one he wanted to hear. He did want something with a good ending. So John suggested The Wizard of Oz, telling him about how Dorothy was trying to find her way back home to Aunt Em and Uncle Henry in Kansas. To Brogden's pleasant surprise, John was a very expressive reader. He made up all sorts of voices for the characters, which made the story really come alive. Brogden was just a little scared of the Wicked Witch and was delighted by the Munchkins. Gradually, his eyelids began to droop, and much as he tried to stay awake, he had fallen asleep by the time Dorothy and Toto were on the yellow brick road and meeting the Scarecrow. John closed the book, and Elaine brushed Brogden's hair away from his eyes. They stood smiling at their unexpected tiny visitor. "Good night, Brogden. Good night, little Brogden," she whispered. And they stood a minute in the doorway, and then John flicked off the light and shut the door. We have enough time today to go right on to the next chapter. So this is chapter 8 of Down the Swale. Now, although Brogden was so tired, he only slept soundly for the first few hours. A few minutes past midnight, he was awakened by a strange humming sound. At first, he shrugged it off as some sort of animal or bird outside. He slid down the quilt and went over to the large window, stood there listening. But the humming noise was not coming from outside. Wonder where it's coming from. The sound grew louder and louder. And the floor, began vibrating underneath his feet. The longer he stood there, the more unnerved he became. He scrambled back into bed where he tossed and turned for the next 5 minutes, unable to sleep. The humming sound continued, and he couldn't imagine what it was. But he was wide awake, so he finally decided to get up and investigate. It was difficult for Brogden to open the door because he was so short. Remember, he's only a foot tall. So he took one of the reed flutes and pushed on the doorknob with it. And after several moments of trying, he finally managed to get the knob to turn, and the door swung open. He padded down the hall to the first room where, peering through the open door, he could see John and Elaine sleeping. He felt somewhat silly and began to reconsider an idea he'd had about waking them up on account of his being scared. He'd just go back to bed and pull the covers up over his head, he decided. But as he turned to do so, the humming sound grew louder. It was definitely louder from where he stood in the hallway than it had been in the guest room. As he made his way back down the hallway, he stopped in front of the door to the second room. It had been firmly shut when they all came upstairs and when he had been going to and from the bath. But as he passed it this time, he noticed that it was propped open. He pushed on it gingerly with his pointing finger, and it swung open with a creak. Peering through the opening, he was shocked to discover it wasn't another bedroom as he'd been expecting. He slipped inside to take a closer look. It was like an office of some sorts. There were more shelves of books along one of the walls. However, the books in this room were of all sorts of colors and shapes and sizes and were sloppily stacked in no apparent order. A second wall was completely covered in cork. Maps were pinned to it and covered almost all of it. Against the third wall, dozens of white plastic containers were stacked 3 and 4 high. One of the containers was partly open, and Brogden walked over and stood on tiptoe to peer inside. The container was filled with walnut-sized orangey pellets, and he reached inside to feel one of them. It had a powdery feel, and when it broke apart in his fingers, it gave off a shrimpy smell. Brogden wondered if John also used these pellets in the fish food slingshot. And if not, what kind of creature would eat such things? He hadn't recalled seeing any pets in the room downstairs. Maybe the pellets were used as fishing bait. A small single lamp on the desk cast a soft amber glow throughout the room. Brogden shimmied up the chair leg and climbed onto the top of the desk. It was piled high with more books and a hodgepodge of papers. Concealed under one of the papers was a book with a blue leather cover. If he'd been able to read, he would have known that it said, Elaine's journal on the front. A small gold lock held the pages shut, and Brogden wondered why a book would be secured in this way. He walked around the top of the desk in search of a key, but stopped in his tracks when he heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, he pulled the top drawer open and crouched down inside it. He wriggled so that the drawer almost closed and then watched through the opening. It was John. He strode into the room towards the containers. He spoke quietly to himself as he lifted one of them and carried it towards the door. Not that I mind, but I hope our little baby will outgrow these nighttime feedings soon, he muttered. Then we'll get a decent night's sleep. Brogden was puzzled. Little baby? What little baby? And that's where we'll stop for today. I see Mimi still sitting back there. I don't know if she's sleeping or listening to the story. I was listening to the story, and I have a question. What's your question, Bookwormy? Who's the little baby? I don't know. Remember, Brogden didn't see any human babies or any animal babies, so I wonder who John is talking about. You know what the only way to find out is? Read on! That's right, we have to read on, but we're not going to read on today. We're going to read on tomorrow. Okay, sounds like a good plan. So you come back tomorrow and you can find out who the baby is. Find out what in the world they're talking about. You got it, Bookwormy. We'll see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow.